And now our last speaker of this morning is Geerte Savenije, ook from the Erasmus University in Rotterdam.
Good morning. Just try to find my presentation. Thank you very much. Thanks to the organization for letting me have this paper here today. A little bit lower. As a researcher, I work at Erasmus University in Rotterdam, and today I will present some results of one of my case studies on heritage education in the Netherlands. And this is part of a larger program, the same as that one of Pieter de Bruin, supervised by Maria Grever and Carla van Bokstel. You can find all you want to know about that on the website, so I'll leave it with that. My plan for today is a brief introduction, and after that I will outline the method of my case study. Then I will discuss some aspects of the entrance narratives, or entry narratives, as I just heard Sam say, of students who did a project on slavery and Atlantic slave trade. And after that I will turn to their experience during the museum visit. And all this will lead hopefully to some concluding remarks, which will maybe be rather points of reflection about the objectives of educational approaches of museums. I find it really interesting to see the many links between the papers today, and especially the 7 issues to consider, and I think you will recognize many of it. Let's first look at this picture. The part in the back I enlarged a bit because it was hard to see. When we let sink in this image for a moment, I think thoughts come to our mind, and maybe feelings as well, or memories, maybe even, or associations. I think we attribute meanings to this statue. And the interesting thing about heritage, I find, is the fact that it raises many questions. This statue must be important to someone because it's there. It's not neglected because it's taken care of well. So it's important to someone, but to whom and for what reasons? Could it be important to me as well? Or how do I relate to the meanings people attribute to this statue? Well, this particular statue is the slavery monument in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam. And this is the monument students in my project visited, so it gives you some clue of what they saw. I think to know something about these memories, first thoughts and emotions students have when seeing such a statue is really interesting when you engage them in a project, and especially when it concerns challenging history or sensitive heritage, like I call it. This is part of the entrance narratives I'm going to talk about. To give you just a short impression of this term, maybe many of you know it already because it's introduced by museologists, so I'm not sure about that, but it's just a way to look at the stories students already have when they enter a project. So they're full of ideas, and you can't see them as a blank page. Well, I put all those different blobs in to let you know it's really a huge thing. Everything is in it, and it's related, interrelated. But you can't get them all apart, but I try to because I have to analyze them. And these narratives are influenced by various sources of knowledge, like school and family, media, peers. Now, when students enter a learning experience, I think this experience is influenced by those entrance narratives and by the way they attribute meaning to what they encounter. And we think heritage might open possibilities to discuss these ideas on significance, just because of the questions I asked in the beginning. Students add significance to history and heritage in many ways. And sometimes these can be related to their background or their source of knowledge. I think it's important to stimulate students to express those ideas to get a more dynamic approach of heritage, to avoid exclusion, like my colleague already said. Okay, I will now turn to my case study. It's a case study on slavery and transatlantic slave trade. These drawings you see here are used in a group task during the project. Students had to choose between 9 pictures. They had to choose 5 of them which were most important to themselves or which they found most important for society. You see here on the left it's the question whether or not to preserve heritage in the beginning. And on the right you see the way heritage is passed on from generation to generation. I'll quickly go through my method. It's a multiple case study in the Netherlands with 2 multicultural urban classrooms in secondary education in Amsterdam. They were 13, 14 years old, and both classes engaged in a project which included a visit to the Institute NINSE, which is the National Institute for Dutch Slavery and Heritage. And they did a lesson at school in advance and after the visit as well. So that's okay. My measurements. We did lots of measurements. Well, first of all, we did some whole class questionnaires at the beginning of the project, before the project, and after each lesson. We composed 2 triads in each class, which we video recorded during the project all time, so they were followed everywhere. And we interviewed those triad students individually before and after the project to get a clearer view of those entrance narratives. Okay, now what can we say about these entrance narratives? I will focus on some aspects, I can't tell them all, especially on the ideas on significance and on students' interest, and the way they were shared between students. We saw that students shared an interest in the subject. They scored really high on interest before the project and after the project. Didn't change that much. 80% of the students was very interested, so that's a lot, and especially in issues of equality and freedom and in heritage of slavery. The same percentage, 80%, scored really high on the significance of slavery heritage. They all found slavery heritage really significant before the project and after the project. Not so much changes there as well. And they especially agreed that slavery heritage is significant for descendants of enslaved people, and to remember there hasn't always been equality and freedom. Still, there were some differences, and they came to the fore in the individual interviews. I'll present some examples of that in a moment, but it's interesting to see that those differences weren't that much discussed within the classrooms. So the triads didn't discuss really that much, and they just came to agreement for the duration of the task. So it's more of a pragmatic agreement. We thought maybe they would discuss, but they didn't that much. And they did not engage in a personal way. Well, we checked for influences of students' background on their entrance narratives, and overall we found no influences of students' source of knowledge or their perceived ethnic identity. That is, no significant influences. The only point we saw some significant higher scores were in the group of Surinamese and Antillean students that scored a little bit higher in the way they attributed significance to slavery heritage for their own families and for their personal identities. Okay, so I'll show you some examples to get more insight, more quality. Many students reflected on the significance of slavery heritage to remember there hasn't always been equality and freedom, like I said, like Fazanta and Tara. But you see a difference between those. two girls. Fazanta was a girl who didn't know how to describe her ethnicity or religious feelings yet. In both cases she said, I don't know yet, maybe Dutch, maybe something else, maybe Hindu, maybe Catholic. She couldn't describe it yet. And she said, because, well, everybody is equal now and it's just important, well, how it started and so. I just find that really interesting. Yes, just the main, that everybody became equal and free. Tara, however, who described herself as a non-religious Dutch Surinamese Spanish girl, said, I think what is most important is that there was no equality. That just really got to me, no freedom. There are still enough people who have that often. There you have that black one, or there you have that ape, or these kinds of things. Well, I just think that's really bad. Well, the translation is a bit awkward, but we try to keep as close to the scripts. And you see that Tara, while Fazanta said there is no inequality anymore today, Tara relates the inequality of the slavery era to inequality in Dutch society today. So that's an interesting difference. Some students felt more personally engaged to the subject. The next two students considered their own ethnic identity partly Antillean or Surinamese, and both knew their families had been involved in slavery at the time. However, their background did result in a similar position to slavery heritage. First, Evelyn described herself as a Christian Dutch Antillean girl. She said, yes, I think, well, it's like personally who I am. Yes, because I think now there's no more slavery, so it has nothing to do with me. And I have never had anything to do with it or so. I have never had to work or my father being taken away suddenly or anything, so I think it doesn't belong with me. Julio, on the other side, described himself as Surinamese, Polish, not religious boy. He said, in the past people were just very racist and I am now black too. And yes, I just cannot understand that people did that they were so racist. And well, I think it's important to remember that because they were racist to my family as well. It's interesting to see that those two students really engaged in a different way. And I think it's especially interesting to considering the fact that such a large part of the students ascribe slavery heritage solely to descendants of enslaved people, while you see Evelyn doesn't agree with that at all. So, okay, last example. Students related to slavery heritage in another way as well. Most students were not aware of the role of the Dutch in slavery history in advance of the project. And between those students who were, we see an interesting difference. First, Clarence, who was a Christian Dutch Ghanaian boy, he said, most Dutch people traded those slaves to America. I asked, why do you think it's important for the Netherlands to preserve that heritage? So they know too, realize that they did something bad and that they will be a bit sorry. Bas, who described himself as not religious Dutch boy, well, the Netherlands had many slaves, and that is kind of shameful when you think you are Dutch too, and that you have just abused people, in fact, or well, your ancestors. That is kind of shameful that we have abused people so badly. I think these examples form a good argument for the importance of acknowledging students' interest narratives in learning activities, because you would want to know about these differences and about these thoughts in students' heads before entering. So let's quickly turn to the experience. This is another drawing of the group task, showing a slavery boat. Okay, thank you. First, students' interest. You can see here the general interest of students before the project in the left bar, and then it goes up. The highest is in the museum visit, and then it turns down a little bit. So we see here that students were significantly more interested during the visit. Here you see some of the emotions. We asked the students to tick some emoticons. It's interesting to see that the bars board and neutral, which are the second and fourth, you see a drop down in the museum visit lesson, while the bars of ashamed and compassionate grow a little bit. So you see those things. No? It's not clear? I see some people asking. It's too small? Oh, sorry, thank you. Well, on the left is the ashamed. So you see the green bar is the museum visit. You see it go up a little bit. Then comes bored, those 3 bars, and the green bar of bored is a little more down. The third group is compassionate with a higher green bar. And then on the right is neutral. And there you see that students felt less neutral during the museum visit, the green bar. Am I clear now? Okay. Hope so. I'll give you a little peek into the exhibition of Ninzé. Many students described sensational experience during this visit. They said it gave them a better image of the slavery era, and it made them feel like it really happened. So that's interesting, I think, as well for museum educators. We also asked students to write down their first thoughts. Maybe you recognize a bit of the method of Ruben Smit as well. The mentioning of heritage increased a lot after the visit, so students mentioned heritage in many ways. To give you some examples, as a first thought, many students mentioned the boat in the museum. I just showed it. The most interesting thing, you can see the weapons and methods of torture. You see the heritage mentioned as well here. And what they didn't know was that there is a monument for slavery. Well, this just by showing something is already a learning result, I think. To conclude, students' entrance narratives of slavery, history, and heritage showed several similarities. All students found the slavery heritage significant for descendants of enslaved people, even before the visiting of Ninzé. However, a deeper discussion of the matter in the interview showed that students did differ in their ideas, and that they attributed meaning and significance in many ways to heritage. Considering this wide variety, it would be interesting to encourage students to express their own ideas and reflect on these and other perspectives in the rich environment that a museum offers to them. So I was asking myself, reflection or transmission. And then the second point, the museum lesson enlivened students' image of the slavery past, like they said, and they were fascinated by the heritage object and stories. This heritage appears to offer an interesting, inspiring opening for learning about and discussing the history of slavery and slavery heritage, and for improving their understanding of it, without, however, framing it within our own perspectives and ideas. So it might be worthwhile to consider whether heritage institutions should pay less attention to create awareness and evoking empathy in favor of reflecting on these ideas that students already have, and using heritage to open up the discussion. Thank you for your attention.